My husband slid divorce papers across our marble kitchen island and told me the prenup meant I would leave with nothing. His mother stood beside him in silk pajamas, sipping espresso like she had been waiting years to see that moment. Then he smiled and said, "You signed it, Vivian." Zero is still zero. But I didn't know that one buried email, one overlooked witness, and one legal loophole were about to turn their perfect trap into my cleanest victory. If you love quiet revenge and elegant justice, stay with me. This one starts with humiliation and ends with a contract collapsing in open court. My name is Vivian Hart. I was 31, a paralegal, and the kind of woman people underestimate because I don't waste words. I built timelines for attorneys, caught contradictions in affidavits, and knew exactly how often people hang themselves with documents they thought nobody would read closely. I was not dramatic, I was precise. At work, I handled family law files full of panic, betrayal, and badly disguised greed. I knew what coercion looked like when it wore a nice suit. I knew what fraud looked like when it arrived with signatures and a smug face. Most of all, I knew that paperwork only protects the person who understands how it was made. My husband forgot that. My mother-in-law never even considered it. When I first met Daniel's mother, Lorraine, she took one look at my department store dress and said, "You're very pretty in a practical way." Daniel laughed like she'd made a charming joke. I smiled and kept my fork steady. That was my introduction to the family. After we got married, Lorraine inserted herself into everything. She had opinions about where we lived, what dishes I served, how I folded towels, and why Daniel should focus on wealth building while I handled the invisible labor that made his life easy. She called me sweet girl when she wanted to diminish me, and family when she needed a favor. Daniel wasn't cruel in obvious ways at first. He was polished, ambitious, and deeply addicted to appearing reasonable. In public, he opened doors and praised my intelligence. In private, he let Lorraine speak over me, dismissed my concerns as stress, and treated every compromise like a generous favor he had invented. I learned quickly that in that family, charm was just control wearing a better jacket. The real betrayal didn't begin with the divorce papers. It began 2 days before our wedding. We were supposed to be finalizing seating charts at Lorraine's house. Instead, Daniel closed the dining room doors, placed a leather folder in front of me, and said there was just one last thing before the ceremony. Lorraine sat at the far end of the table like she was chairing a board meeting. I opened the folder and saw the word Prenup in bold. I looked up slowly. This is a joke. Daniel leaned back in his chair. It's standard. My mother's attorney says it protects family interests. Lorraine gave me a pitying smile. If you're marrying for love, it shouldn't bother you. I should have walked out. I know that now. But the florist was booked, guests were arriving the next morning, my mother had already paid for flights she could barely afford, and Daniel knew exactly how much pressure lived in the timing. He also knew I hated public disaster more than almost anything. I said, "I need time to review this." "You have an hour," Lorraine replied. That's when I understood this was not a conversation. It was an ambush. The prenup was dense, one-sided, and designed to strip me of almost everything if the marriage ended. Separate property definitions were stretched beyond reason. Appreciation on marital contributions tilted toward him. Support waivers were aggressive. There was even language suggesting any interruption of my career for domestic reasons would not create compensable dependence. It was a trap in expensive binding. But I signed. And 3 years later, Daniel stood in our kitchen with those divorce papers and used that signature like a weapon. By then, I had spent 3 years helping him build the life he loved to brag about. I had handled our household while he expanded his consulting firm. I had edited proposals, organized client dinners, and quietly left work early more times than I can count because Daniel needed me available for his image-driven emergencies. We lived in a house purchased after the wedding, furnished with money earned during the marriage, and renovated partly with a bonus I had received from work. If the prenup held, I could lose the home, meaningful support, and any fair share of the growth I had helped make possible. Worse, Daniel would control the story. Lorraine would tell people I had tried to marry into money and failed. Their version would become truth unless I broke it apart piece by piece. And there was one more thing at stake. My pride. Not the fragile kind. The quiet kind. The part of me that refused to let two smug people turn coercion into a moral lesson about why I deserved nothing. But I didn't know how careless they had been. Not yet. Daniel's attorney sent over a draft settlement 48 hours after filing. It was almost elegant in its insult. I would receive my personal effects, my compact sedan, one small checking account, and a decorative clause allowing me to keep all jewelry gifted solely to wife during the marriage, as if earrings could replace equity. Attached to the offer was a note from Daniel in the body of an email. The prenup says you get 0. This is more than fair. Lorraine followed up with her own message 20 minutes later. Take the graceful exit, Vivian. Some women would be grateful. That offer was the worthless gift, not because it had no monetary value at all, but because it was built on humiliation. They wanted me to feel lucky for being discarded politely. They expected me to fold because the document looked official and the tone sounded final. Instead, I created a folder on my laptop called Prenup Timeline and started building the case they never imagined I could make. The next morning, I pulled every email I still had from the week before the wedding. 8 months later, Daniel was still telling friends the divorce was simple, which was interesting because simple divorces do not usually involve 4 amended filings, 2 motions to compel, and 1 increasingly irritated judge. Lorraine stopped calling me directly and began using lawyers as shields. That alone told me I was getting close. In those 8 months, I reconstructed the 48 hours before I signed the prenup minute by minute, email timestamps, calendar entries, venue invoices, text messages, rideshare receipts, a salon confirmation, a frantic voicemail from my cousin asking whether she should still pick up welcome baskets. Pressure leaves a trail if you know how to map it. That's when a detail I had ignored for years started flashing in my memory. The woman who witnessed my signature at Lorraine's house had not introduced herself as an attorney or notary. She had introduced herself as Nina from the office. At the time, I was too cornered to care. 8 months later, I cared very much. Then my phone rang. It was Nina. I had found her through an old vendor holiday card Lorraine once mailed from her office. Nina Alvarez had worked there as an executive assistant 3 years earlier. She now lived 2 towns over and sounded nervous the moment I said my name. I always wondered if that document would come back, she told me. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Nina wore a camel coat and kept both hands around her cup like she needed the heat. She told me Lorraine had pulled her into the dining room that day because the original notary they expected had canceled. Nina was not a notary. She had no legal authority to notarize anything. Lorraine told her not to worry because the formalities would be handled later. My pulse stayed calm, but only because I'm good at keeping my face from giving away the good part. Did anyone tell me that? I asked. No, Nina said. You looked blindsided. That was the first crack. The second came from the email trail. Buried in a chain between Daniel and Lorraine, sent the night before the prenup signing, was a message Daniel had forwarded by mistake to our shared printer account years ago. I found it in an archived PDF cache because I keep strange things, and because computers remember carelessness longer than people do. Lorraine had written, "If she hesitates, remind her guests are arriving and vendors are paid. She won't risk the embarrassment." Daniel replied, "She'll sign. She always chooses peace over spectacle." I stared at that line for a long time. Then I found the legal loophole. The prenup required, by its own terms, that both parties acknowledge voluntary execution, full disclosure of material assets, and the opportunity for independent counsel. Daniel's schedules were incomplete. 2 investment accounts were missing from the attached asset list, and a pending business acquisition was nowhere disclosed despite emails proving negotiations were underway before the wedding. More importantly, the independent counsel clause had a checked box stating I had declined after reasonable opportunity. I had never been given one. That's when the whole thing sharpened. Coercion in timing, false notarization, incomplete disclosure, fraudulent acknowledgement. It wasn't one problem. It was a system. Then my phone rang again. This time it was my attorney, Elise Rowan. She had reviewed Nina's statement, the email chain, and the asset schedules. Her exact words were, "Vivian, this prenup is not surviving contact with a competent court." Elise scheduled a settlement conference before the motion hearing, mostly as a courtesy and partly because she enjoyed giving arrogant people one chance to save themselves. We met in a polished conference room with glass walls, expensive water bottles, and the kind of silence that makes liars overperform. Daniel arrived first, crisp suit, expensive watch, controlled smile. Lorraine came with him in pearl earrings and a winter white blazer, looking less like a mother and more like hostile counsel who had missed her calling. They both seemed certain the prenup would end the conversation before it began. Elise began pleasantly. We're here to discuss whether your clients would like to resolve this before the court rules on enforceability. Daniel gave a small laugh. There's nothing to rule on, she signed. I folded my hands. Under coercion, without valid notarization, and without full disclosure. Lorraine's expression tightened by half an inch. That is a dramatic interpretation. Elise slid the email chain across the table. This is not interpretation, this is planning. Daniel looked at the page, then at his mother. Lorraine said, those emails are taken out of context. Elise placed Nina's signed witness statement beside them. And this? No one spoke for 2 full seconds. That's when Daniel tried the old tone, the one he used when he wanted me to feel emotional and therefore less credible. Vivian, come on. You're blowing this up because you're angry. I met his eyes and kept my voice level. No, I'm blowing it up because you built it on fraud. Lorraine leaned forward. You were lucky to marry into this family. I almost smiled. And you were careless enough to put that in writing. That landed harder than I expected. Elise continued with surgical calm. She outlined the missing asset disclosures, the invalid witness problem, the pressure timing, and the contradiction between the prenup's voluntary execution language and the documented circumstances. Then she mentioned the business acquisition Daniel failed to disclose before the wedding, along with a draft term sheet dated 5 days earlier. For the first time, Daniel looked afraid. You went through my files? He asked. No, I said, I went through ours. The hearing was 2 weeks later. Family court is rarely glamorous, but there is a particular beauty in watching a polished lie lose structure under oath. Elise argued first, calm and devastating. She presented the timeline of coercion, the incomplete asset schedules, Nina's witness testimony, and the email chain proving Daniel and Lorraine anticipated pressure would force my signature. Then she introduced the technical problem that made everything worse. The so-called notarization trail was defective, and the later correction attempt created a discrepancy in execution records. Daniel's attorney tried to salvage enforceability by calling the defects harmless. The judge disagreed almost immediately. Harm is not the question, she said. Voluntariness and disclosure are. Nina testified next. She did not embellish. She did not need to. She simply stated that she was not a notary, that I appeared surprised, and that Lorraine instructed her to sign as witness because we need this finished before she gets ideas. I watched Lorraine's face go very still. Then the email came in. The judge read Lorraine's message about guests arriving and embarrassment, then Daniel's reply about how I would sign to avoid spectacle. No outrage, no dramatic gasp. Just the slow, quiet death of their credibility in the official record. That was the twist they never prepared for. They thought the prenup was a wall. In court, it became evidence. The judge ruled the agreement unenforceable due to procedural and substantive defects, including coercive timing, inadequate opportunity for counsel, questionable witnessing formalities, and materially incomplete financial disclosure. Once the prenup fell, everything reopened. Property division, support, reimbursement claims, attorney's fees. Daniel's expression changed from confidence to calculation to something uglier when he realized the numbers would no longer bend his way. Lorraine never looked at me again after the ruling. She looked at the bench, then at her son, as if trying to decide which of them had failed her more. The settlement that followed was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was correct. I received a favorable share of the marital assets, compensation tied to the funds I had contributed to the house renovation, temporary support during transition, and attorney's fees based partly on Daniel's conduct surrounding enforcement of the defective prenup. The man who had told me I would get 0 ended up paying for the privilege of saying it. A year later, I lived in a bright apartment with tall windows, clean lines, and none of Lorraine's opinions in it. My dining table fit exactly 4 people, which meant every guest there had been chosen. I slept better. I laughed more quietly but more often. Peace, I learned, does not need a large house to sound expensive. Sometimes people ask whether I regret signing that prenup in the first place. The honest answer is yes. I regret the pressure, the fear, and the version of myself that thought keeping the peace was worth swallowing the warning in my own throat. But I do not regret what happened after. Because once the trap snapped shut, I finally saw the architecture. Daniel wanted a wife who would stay soft under pressure. Lorraine wanted a daughter-in-law who would stay grateful while being managed. What they got instead was a paralegal with an archive, a memory for detail, and enough patience to let their own paperwork speak. Moral: never trust a contract born in pressure and secrecy. If someone says a document is final, read the circumstances that created it before you read the signature line. And when people build a trap for you with fraud, let the court turn it into evidence. Tell me in the comments, at what moment did you know the prenup was doomed? And subscribe for more family drama stories where betrayal meets elegant justice.